The story of Dark Souls is a dramatic exploration of ancient archetypal ideas, some of the most fundamental narrative recurrences in stories, mythologies, and religions. It presents an overview of these ideas, presented in such a way that reduces things to an almost anthropomorphism, an embodiment of ideas like light and dark, and order and chaos. There are so many ways in which these concepts are imagined in the Dark Souls series, and there's no way we can touch on all of them, but I will try and cover as many as possible. Of course, like my previous analyses, there's a few quick disclaimers. Firstly, that I'm not a lore expert, just know enough to explore thoroughly, but I might not get everything exactly right. FromSoft notoriously makes it difficult for everything to be understood completely, so maybe that is to be expected. Secondly, FromSoft always takes these tropes and turns them on their heads. Mostly, I'll be trying to point that out, but essentially, if I'm analyzing an archetype that is normally where one thing is good and the other is bad, that's probably not true in the sense of the Dark Souls story, where few characters are ever really approaching right or wrong. In the world of Dark Souls, everything is fairly corrupted. Lastly, I'm only focusing on the stories and elements in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3. I've played and learned a little bit about Dark Souls 2, but not enough to comment on it, and just happen not to have enjoyed it as much as the mainstream games of 1 and 3, which exist essentially in the same storyline. Without further ado, let's get into the exploration. The first thing I want to talk about is actually the basis of my entire thought about these games and their relation to narrative archetypes, and that is the way in which the Dark Souls story is founded upon these really fundamental concepts. The entire starting point is on the discovery of fire in the midst of darkness. Out of the fire comes disparity, as the opening cutscene tells us, and this is quite true to the idea that it states. Light being contrast to darkness is sort of the basis on which all other contrasts rest. In the Christian tradition, the world begins as an abyssal darkness of deep waters, and then God says, "Let there be light." This is strikingly similar to the fire in the darkness that spurs off the opening to Dark Souls 1. Out of the first disparity come these other archetypal concepts. We have darkness and death with Nido, first of the dead. We have chaos and fire in the witches and the flame of chaos. We have sunlight and lightning, power, pride, and order, all embodied in Gwyn, and also something like humanity, embodied in the furtive pygmy. Beyond this, there is also a few others. The primordial dragons are one. We also have the abyss, and also some of the ideas like the dark moon and the deep. These are embodiments of concepts that have existed since the origins of the world, which is why I just call them fundamental ideas. These things are perhaps so ingrained in nearly any world culture that any culture would understand references to them. Primordial darkness is a universal concept, flame a universal symbol, death a universal reality. But other of the concepts are explored in interesting ways. Consider order and chaos. Obviously, the flame of chaos is an interesting example. Fire is sort of chaotic in its very nature. It represents this wavering and unstable state. It is also the ancient discovery of fire, which is sort of the ascension of humanity, so much in the real world as in Dark Souls. Typically, the opposite of fire would be ice or water, so it's interesting that the opposite of chaos here is Gwyn's order of sunlight. Sunlight is a reasonable symbol for order. It is the constant stability and the representation of day, which is the orderly opposite to night. Fire, then, is almost just a perversion of light. The sun, from its distance, seems stable and orderly, but on close examination is fiery, tumultuous, and even chaotic. Let's focus in on one thing at a time. The flame of chaos is directly associated with the feminine, which is a typical analogy. Traditionally, masculinity is associated with order and day, and femininity is associated with chaos and night. We talked a good deal about this in my Elden Ring analysis. We can see both of these present in Dark Souls. The feminine witches are the appropriators of the chaos flame, called witches seemingly for this misappropriation of the fire and almost heretical declamation of order. It's interesting that Gwyn's light is reached by proceeding all the way up to the Golden City, in high height, and the chaos flame is found in something like the deepest depths, even though they aren't necessarily. Gwyn's day-like order is manifested in a number of ways. In perpetual fashion, FromSoft associates sunshine with golden and lightning, and Orlando is a heavenly city of gold, complete with Gwyn's golden light. But really interesting is the fact that Gwyn makes use of fire as part of his repertoire, so there is a separation between fire and the chaos flame. The chaos flame is an archetypal representation of chaos. It's sort of like a forbidden fruit, a thing to interact with at one's peril. All of these order, chaos ideas recur heavily in Elden Ring, so see my prior video on that, but consider the way in which Leyndell in Elden Ring is a heavenly golden city representing a golden order of light, but far below it exists the flame of corrupting chaos. This analysis is not complete without the implementation of the ideas of angels and demons, or otherwise gods and monsters. The orderly golden city I have already compared to heaven, but it is also not dissimilar to the raised city atop Mount Olympus, especially noticeable in Orlando. From the golden city, the gods or the angels command the heavens, being weather and lightning and sun and things in that vein. Obviously, Gwyn resembles Zeus in many ways, not least of which is his lightning wielding and position as father of the gods and demigods. Gwyn's children will come up later in the analysis, as each of them contributes to other archetypes and symbols. Down below is the flame of chaos, much like Hades or Hell, a fiery domain beneath the earth, complete with witches and demons. Even though Gwyn is a corrupt figure, more Zeus than angelic, the chaos flame will seem to represent everything that is held negatively in archetypal fashion. Evil creatures, monsters, and demons always dwell in the fiery depths of Hades or Gehenna, and the witches who interact with this flame become deformed creatures, complete with the atrocious boss, the Bed of Chaos. That's atrocious both in the symbolic sense and also in the fact that it's a badly designed boss. In any event, this first set of disparity showcases a mostly traditional symbolic combat, that of heaven versus hell, and gods versus monsters, light versus darkness, and order versus chaos. The corruptness of the order ideal that makes it not a true good is in its overreach, primarily. The intention of Gwyn's order is to establish perpetuity, as we see in the progression from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3. Dynasties rise and fall, but the orderly relinking of the flame is ordained to occur over and over and over again, which reveals Dark Souls' true desire to examine the cyclical nature of things in general. This is because Dark Souls takes place in a universe that is only cyclical. There is no end in sight, no goal, and no objective. The only goal given is to relink the first flame. You spend the game trying to figure out why, and by the time you do, the cycle is ready to repeat. Even the endings of Dark Souls 3 infer the continuation of the cycle in most circumstances. It is not clear that any usurpation is going to end the eventual, seemingly natural repeat of the flame linking. The second primary disparity is life and death. We're first introduced to Nito, the first of the dead. Because death is essentially a curse in Dark Souls, no one dies or ceases to exist or goes to an underworld, but rather is perpetually alive in some sense. So Nito is really the lord of the undead. This is the grave and the tombs and necromancy. The other end of this seems to be the furtive pygmy, or the humans, who are the representations of life. Most interestingly, in the Dark Souls concept, death has almost lost its effect. As in our world, death is in many ways the arbiter that gives value to life. But in Dark Souls, it's simply another way of existing, in a different form, but in the same plane. The undead in Dark Souls are almost like lost souls, dwelling in coffins and tombs and catacombs, much like ghosts, wishing for death but not finding it. The human lifeforms are not far off, trapped in a cyclical curse of being reborn to accomplish the same purpose, perhaps wishing for life but not finding it. Which is why one of the first we meet is the Crestfallen, suffering from some big boy depression about the lack of life. The concept is accentuated in the game's mechanic of going hollow, where a pygmy who has repeated the cycle of life and death too many times becomes completely unrecognizable and unconscious and might as well be dead. So we have heaven and hell and the grave and the earth, essentially aspects of the four levels one might state for the planes of existence. There are more that I mentioned that are not in this opening cutscene 4. I think the strongest example of that is the Abyss. An idea of the Abyss exists in mythologies and religions across many cultures. You've likely heard the old expression, having stared into the abyss and the abyss stared back. It's like the concept of emptiness, nothingness, or oblivion. It is sheer nothingness. It's more than darkness, it's a consumption of light. It's oppressive darkness where light cannot even hope to shine. The Abyss represents perhaps the farthest edge of the going hollow concept. Enough exposure to life, death, heaven, and hell in meaningless perpetuity leads to hollowness, emptiness, oblivion, and the void. In fact, the Abyss is seemingly fathered by Manus when his dark soul begins infinitely expanding as he searches for something he cannot find. The search for the unfindable is much the story of everything that occurs in Dark Souls. The game's message I take as something in the realm of life being a meaningless repeat of things, in the mix of which powers and opposites collide and compete, but all the striving results in the same outcome, and eventually the abyss overtakes all. This eternal darkness idea of the abyss also seems to relate to the idea of primordial chaos, the dark in which the flame appears at the beginning of Dark Souls, or the dark waters from which God says let there be light in the genesis of the world. To the cyclical point, it is as though even if the abyss could consume all of the world in Dark Souls, resulting in a dark nothingness, an unexplainable flame may rise out of it and start the cycle all over again. But interestingly, the idea consistent with the primordial deep in parallel to the abyss will be revisited as a separate fundamental concept in Dark Souls 3 to be discussed shortly. Having accepted the depressing reality of the pointlessness that embodies the world of Dark Souls, we can look into the specific concepts that manifest within that seeming pointlessness. Another, present from the beginning, is the ancient dragons. As I mentioned in my Elden Ring video, this is a recurring trope that I find very interesting in FromSoft's work. The serpent and dragon is another universal symbol, and all major religions and mythologies have an idea of primordial serpents. Often, serpents represent a negative motif, the primordial serpent in Christianity or Judaism being the deceiver of mankind. Perhaps the most pertinent is the ancient Mesopotamian creation myth, where the power god Marduk defeats the ancient serpent Tiamat and builds reality out of her dead body. In Dark Souls, the new powers associated with the fire use this power to defeat the ruling dragons and begin a new age marked by their demise. Defeating the primordial serpent typically represents order being extracted out of chaos, which can be seen with Gwyn leading the charge and becoming the order symbol in the Age of Fire, though the aforementioned witches of Izalith maintain a facet of chaos in this new age. Interestingly, the Tiamat idea also relates directly to the idea of the primordial waters, which I related to the abyss, water and serpentine symbolism being common within one another. Among the primordial dragons emerges Seath the Scaleless, who betrays them to aid in their demise. The betrayal story is quite interesting. Evidently, Seath being scaleless is sort of rejected and bullied by the other dragons, and chooses to betray them for a place in Gwyn's empire, where he can study his sorceries in peace perpetually. Seath's malformity of scalelessness relates to the power of moonlight, from which he creates sorcery, another interesting parallel. Sorcery is typically always associated with night and moonlight, as I said in my Elden Ring video. The night concept also relates to the concept of secrecy and betrayal, which Seath embodies. We see from Seath's later experiments that he is motivated heavily by envy of his brethren, as the scale dragons were rendered immortal by their scales, and most of Seath's experiments were born from an attempt to take that power for his own. In many ways, this makes Seath a satanic figure of the Draconic Age, betraying with the intent to steal the ultimate power, but ending up just always hunting after it. In the Age of Fire, Seath is only a shell of whatever he may have attempted to become. If we loop around to the start of the game in Dark Souls 1, we can evaluate the way that these themes further unfold themselves in the progression of the story. In some ways, the player in the game starts not far in concept from how humanity starts their journey in the biblical worldview. Consider the idea of the fall from grace. Humanity loses divine favor and is cast into a mortal, suffering existence. In Dark Souls, the Age of Ancients gives way to the Age of Fire, marked by the fall of powerful beings like Gwyn and humanity's descent into a cursed, hollow existence. The undead curse symbolizes humanity's fallen state. There is even some overlap to the idea of sin, in the idea that Gwyn sinned in his decision to link the flame in order to prolong the Age of Light. Sin leads to moral and spiritual corruption. Humanity is cursed with undeath, a state that leads to hollowing, which is a loss of purpose in humanity, representing spiritual and existential corruption. Much like Gwyn, the player has a sort of choice to sin as well. They face constant choices which determine one of two endings, and all those choices are influenced by the manipulation of one of two different serpents. Much like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, Frampt appears in the peaceful Firelink Shrine. Contrarily, Koth appears from the dark and seems to be a much more directly deceitful figure, though it is not clear at all who is really telling the truth. In Dark Souls fashion, it's heavily suggested that Koth is more so the correct view, that an Age of Dark must come to balance the Age of Light. The religious worldview leads from the garden out into the world of suffering, where they search for meaning and God's purpose in its midst. In Dark Souls, characters and the players wrestle with existential questions about purpose, identity, and the nature of the curse, mirroring humanity's search for meaning in a seemingly indifferent universe. Those who don't find it proceed to hollow out, as we mentioned before, becoming meaningless or even nihilistic. But the chosen undead is selected for a special pilgrimage, and the game specifically uses this religious language to demonstrate the nature of the journey, because it was set up as a false religion by Gwyn in order to preserve the continuous fire linking and prolonging of the Age of Fire. The chosen undead embarks on a perilous journey to fulfill a prophecy, traversing dangerous lands and defeating mighty foes to either rekindle the flame or usher in the Age of Dark. The pilgrimage mirrors the journeys of biblical figures like Moses or the Apostles, who endure trials to achieve a divine purpose. The chosen undead's quest is also reminiscent of the medieval Christian pilgrimages to sacred sites. This continuous need for pilgrimage also demonstrates the faulty nature of Gwyn's sacrifice when compared to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Christ sacrifices himself one time for all of mankind's sin perpetually, but Gwyn's sacrifice is sufficient only for one extension of the Age of Light, and the sacrifice must be repeated indefinitely by other chosen hollows in order to keep it going. This proceeds all the way into the far future of Dark Souls 3, where the flame has been linked numerous times, and the age extended numerous times until the religious pilgrimage structure is reformatted to choose an Ashen One to take up the task, or even resurrect the flame linkers of the past in order to force the cycle to continue. This religious setup is seen in the manifestation of many other sacred concepts throughout the story. Because Gwyn's servants set the world up in worship of the rekindling, they use religious structure to accomplish these goals. As in all of From Software's works, this structure takes the form of the Christian church, often inspired by the medieval Catholic Church. There are churches and religious iconography in Dark Souls 1, but heavily and especially in Dark Souls 3. In Dark Souls 1, there are items like the Lord Souls, humanity, and bonfires which hold spiritual and practical significance, serving as conduits of power and renewal. Bonfires act as altars or shrines where the faithful connect with the divine. The act of kindling somewhat parallels sacrificial offerings in religious traditions. The rite of kindling allows the player to strengthen bonfires, offering humanity to fuel the flame. This ritual almost mirrors the Eucharist, where bread and wine are offered as a sacrament of Christ's sacrifice. The offering of humanity is akin to spiritual devotion. Firelink Shrine in both games acts as a stepping-off point, a place of preparation for the pilgrim. The altar of the bonfire representing the first flame lies at the center and is maintained by a priestess. In an act of religious ritual, the firekeepers have their eyes removed to prevent visions of a different world. Both games also have shrines to Velka, a goddess associated with removing sin and abstaining from judgment. This allows the player to be absolved of transgressions. There is a grand Gothic church that is located in the Undead Parish, complete with a towering bell tower, high ceilings, and a central altar. The church houses the Bell of Awakening, a sacred artifact tied to the prophecy of the chosen undead. There is a massive, awe-inspiring cathedral located in the City of the Gods and Orlando. Its grand architecture, stained glass windows, and high ceilings are heavily inspired by Gothic cathedrals. Dark Souls 3 specifically utilizes Catholic church structure, especially in the idea of the Church of the Deep. The Cathedral of the Deep resembles a grand Gothic cathedral once again, complete with towering spires, stained glass windows, and a huge central altar. Its design mirrors Christian cathedrals, which symbolize divine authority and house relics and sacred rituals. Aldrich is a saint, and he has clergy and bishops and deacons who are all clad in religious garb, invocative of Christian clergy. Irithyll also mirrors this, being led by Pontiff Sullivan, Pontiff being a traditional Catholic title sometimes associated with the Pope. Irithyll, with its grand church-like structure and central Pontiff's Cathedral, evokes a medieval Christian city with strong ecclesiastical influence. The Pontiff's throne and ornate decorations suggest a powerful religious authority akin to a bishop or pope. The Church of Yorshka in Irithyll is a more modest, serene chapel. It features a central altar and some pews. Yorshka is a deific figure associated with the Dark Moonblades. She is imprisoned and worshipped in solitude, her situation like the veneration of saints or martyrs who endure suffering for their divine roles. Moving somewhat from the church parallels, the specific structure and members of Gwyn's family has divine and mythological parallels. Gwyn is somewhat of a sun god, almost like Apollo or Ra, but he is perhaps more so a patriarchal god, wielding lightning, which evokes the idea of Zeus, as I mentioned. Because of the nature of his flawed fear of the dark and preceding false sacrifice, I would argue that he also invokes the Antichrist idea of a false savior. The association with light and sun also makes me think of Lucifer and the satanic concept. His daughter Guinevere holds the same idea, reflecting ideas of an ancient fertility goddess such as Demeter, Aphrodite, or Freya. The ancient Canaanites worshipped Asherah or Ashtoreth, the queen of heaven and the wife of Baal, as the female goddess who reflected fertility. The son, Gwyndolin, is especially interesting and unique, but is reflective of a highly unique type that From Software uses. On the surface, he may parallel lunar deities via his association with the moon, secrecy, and illusion. Think of gods like Artemis or Mani in the Norse pantheon. Traditionally, as in Elden Ring, the concepts of lunar and night are usually associated with a chaotic female trope, which is why it's interesting that Gwyndolin is a boy who is raised as a daughter. This idea of an emasculated figure who blurs gender lines is largely related to occult and alchemy symbolism, which is heavily present in From Software's works. I'd highly recommend Max Durat's channel for an extrapolation on the occult symbolism in Dark Souls, and I'll have his video linked below for some extra learning material. The Nameless King is also very interesting, being the firstborn son of Gwyn and the leader of Gwyn's 4 knights, but being expunged from history because of associating himself with loyalty to the ancient dragons. This is also somewhat Luciferian, though I think it allies more closely with the idea of Prometheus, as a traitorous son, but in the context of Dark Souls, it's very hard to argue that the Nameless King is in the wrong. It's also worth mentioning Filianor, the daughter of Gwyn, who is put into perpetual sleep in order to maintain the illusion of a timeless ringed city. She is somewhat like Endymion, the sleeping god from Greek mythology, or even like Sleeping Beauty. She also reminds me of Azathoth in H.P. Lovecraft's canon of gods, whose sleeping results in existence itself being all confined to his dream. Another thought-provoking idea in Dark Souls 1 and 3 is the painted worlds of Ariamis and Ariandel. The painted world serves as a haven for outcasts and those deemed too dangerous or impure for the main world, paralleling the Christian concept of purgatory or a place of spiritual exile. It's a realm where sinners and the forsaken can find solace, much like biblical narratives of the wilderness or the city of refuge in the Old Testament. It reflects themes of atonement and judgment, as its inhabitants are removed from the cycle of fire and dark, existing in almost a liminal space. The painted world's existence hinges on its creator, the painter, who imbues the realm with purpose and life. This is like the Christian notion of God as the creator, who molds reality with divine intent. This is going to come up really importantly later. The act of painting a world into existence resonates with mythological creation stories, such as the Norse Ymir or Hindu Brahma, where the world is crafted through divine will. The painted worlds also represent something of a crossing over point, like Mount Hermon being the crossover point between hell and earth in Judaic tradition. The paintings are literal portals into alternate realities, blending the spiritual and material worlds. Ariamis is populated by beings like the undead and crossbreed Priscilla, who are cast out due to their nature or perceived sins. Priscilla herself is an allegorical figure of innocence and mercy, offering the player the chance to leave peacefully rather than fight. Priscilla offers peace and an escape from violence. Her hybrid nature, half dragon, half goddess, symbolizes a bridge between the divine and the profane, almost like Christ's dual nature as both human and divine. The perpetual snow in Ariamis evokes the biblical association of whiteness with purity and forgiveness. Isaiah 1:18 says, "Though your sins are scarlet, they shall be white as snow." This serene, wintry setting contrasts with the violence and corruption of Lordran, like a spiritual reprieve. The guardians of Ariamis, like the crow demons, are like angelic or demonic figures protecting sacred or cursed spaces, sort of like the cherubim who guard Eden after humanity's exile. Unlike Ariamis, Ariandel's world is decaying, reflecting the consequences of sin, neglect, and divine abandonment. This aligns with Christian apocalyptic imagery, where the world deteriorates due to humanity's moral failings. Sin taints both the soul and the environment. Sister Fried and Father Ariandel resist the flame, seeking to preserve the corrupted world rather than let it burn and be reborn. This reflects a refusal of divine will, or the cyclical nature of judgment and redemption in Dark Souls. At the end of Dark Souls 3, the young painter in Ariandel speaks of creating a new, cold and gentle world, a haven for the forsaken. This almost mirrors the idea of Christian hope of a new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21, where suffering is eradicated and peace prevails. We're going to revisit this idea as it's going to be very important later at the end of my analysis. Much like in my Elden Ring analysis, I think it's important to impress the understanding of these divine beings in correlation with angels and gods. Much like Elden Ring's city of Leyndell being a golden capital, Anor Londo sits as a pristine gold city above the clouds. It is much like the golden city of heaven, from which the gods come, or even the top of Mount Olympus, or Jack and the Beanstalk, where the giants come from up above the clouds. Dark Souls has far less demigod figures than Elden Ring, but as I mentioned, the small pantheon of Gwyn still evokes the concept. Perhaps the other figures we encounter like Nito, the Witches of Izalith, Seath, and Manus, and others can count themselves among this unheavenly host, with wars and disagreement between all of them. After all, most of their Lord Souls must be collected to satiate the vessel. More like the various mythological pantheons, they each have very specific domains that they rule over, like Elysium or Heaven, Hell or Hades or Death or the Abyss or Tartarus, etc. A very interesting antonym to Anor Londo is New Londo, a city that the Four Kings sought to model after the Heavenly City but deep underground. Though it certainly draws parallels to the underworld idea and is directly associated with Koth and the Abyss, I also think in concept it is interestingly reminiscent of the Agarthan idea that I talked about in the Elden Ring video as well. Like a beautiful city underground, an underground paradise, or at least that is what it was intended to be. It is corrupted by the Abyss, which drastically changes the story. The corruption of New Londo leads to its needing to be destroyed. Much like the biblical flood story or the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world becomes corrupted to such a state that it is beyond saving. The Sealers act as priests who decide to flood the city in order to prevent the spread of the Abyss. Especially interestingly, this flooding results in the killed residents going on to become lost, disembodied spirits who haunt the ruins. In the biblical flood story, the Nephilim are human-angel hybrids who account for part of the reason of the flood's necessity. The flood kills them all, and then they become disembodied spirits which we know as demons in the future. In Greek mythology, shades of the dead haunt the underworld, longing for release or remembrance. Another area deep below the ground in Dark Souls is the incredible sight of the Great Hollow and Ash Lake, showing us the scale of underground trees that evidently hold up the entire world. This concept, equally prevalent in Elden Ring, is that of the Axis Mundi, or the World Tree, a universal symbol in many mythologies representing the connection between heaven, earth, the underworld, and the other realms. It's perhaps most obvious as Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and embodied by things like the Tree of Life, or a great tree in other ancient myths and stories. Trees in Christian theology often symbolize life, knowledge, and divine presence, such as the Tree of Life and the Tree of the Knowledge of Good and Evil in Genesis. The ancient trees of Ash Lake might symbolize a pre-fallen world, untouched by sin and corruption like in the Garden of Eden. The lake itself seems to represent the primordial waters, again a place untouched by any of the events going on above. The untouched chaotic waters show themselves in the Bible, in the Mesopotamian creation myths, and in the Nun of Egyptian mythology, for example. Also present at these roots is the ancient everlasting dragon. This is most strikingly like the dragon Nidhogg in Norse mythology, who gnaws at the roots of the tree Yggdrasil. In the Christian tradition, the serpent or dragon is directly present in the garden and tempts man to eat of the knowledge tree. Dragons often seem as guardians of knowledge or treasure. The ancient trees of Ash Lake and their primordial setting evoke the eternal return, a mythological concept where time is cyclical, like in Dark Souls, and existence constantly renews itself. This resonates with the broader themes of Dark Souls, where cycles of fire and dark mirror the endless repetition of life and death. After ascending into the Great Hollow, the chosen undead would continue down into Lost Izalith and the Demon's Ruins, the most obviously hellish and demonic fiery landscape. These fiery depths are the result of what might be called a blasphemy, an attempt to manufacture the primordial first flame in the pursuit of control or power. When the Witch of Izalith tries to perform this act, the fire backfires and distorts everything, transforming her and some of her children into the horrible bed of chaos. The remaining children and other residents are transformed into horrific creatures and demonic half-breed creatures. This much reminds me of Milton's illusions in Paradise Lost, where Satan in his treachery becomes the father of the disgusting in his union with sin. It's akin to a dramatized version of the consequences of eating the forbidden fruit. Theology and various mythologies all have ideas of some sort of forbidden act which results in monstrous offspring such as this. The archetype is sometimes a corrupted mother, such as Medusa or even Gaia, who births both gods and titans. transformation of her into this tree-like bed could also be seen as a Tower of Babel-like lesson, where ambition leads to downfall. The final primary underground region is the Catacombs and the Tomb of the Giants, associated with death, obviously. Gravelord Nito embodies death itself, collecting and commanding the dead. In Christian theology, death is often personified, as seen in Revelation 6:8, where death rides a pale horse. Nito's skeletal form and association with death echoes this imagery. Nito's role as a keeper of the dead mirrors the angel of death, who executes divine judgment and ushers souls into the afterlife. Nito also parallels underworld deities such as Hades, Osiris, and Hel, as in Hel, the Norse god. Like these figures, Nito is not entirely malevolent. He represents the natural order of death, a neutral force rather than antagonistic. Another interesting aspect, the Gravelord's Servant Covenant resembles religious practices honoring the dead, such as Catholic prayers for souls in purgatory. By joining the Covenant, players spread death to other worlds, mirroring rituals that emphasize the inevitability of death and the connectedness of life and the afterlife. The Covenant is also like ancient death cults, like those devoted to Hades or Osiris, where followers sought favor or protection from the forces of the dead. Above ground, a Lord Soul must be retrieved from the aforementioned Seath the Scaleless Dragon, who resides in the Duke's archives. The archives and Seath himself seem to represent the pursuit of knowledge, specifically secret and forbidden knowledge. Seath is a traitor who betrayed his kin in order to obtain their secrets, and is a serpent who seeks to eat of the forbidden fruit he has been denied. Not to mention that this thing forbidden to him is the other dragon's immortality, or eternal life, and in the Garden of Eden, after man eats of the hidden knowledge, they are kicked out to keep them from eating from the Tree of Life, which would result in eternal life. Seath is in pursuit of both, giving him the satanic cast. Seath's pursuit of knowledge also echoes Prometheus, who defied the gods by stealing fire, a symbol of enlightenment, to give to humanity. Prometheus's eternal punishment parallels Seath's descent into madness and imprisonment in his crystal cave. And I think that in Seath's attempt to transcend his natural limitations through forbidden experimentation, we can see connections to the myth of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and fell due to his hubris. In this instance, his flying too close to the sun being literally represented by his choice of closeness with Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight. This pursuit of immortality can also be tied to alchemy. Seath's use of crystals to pursue eternal life symbolizes the mythological and alchemical quest for the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary substance that grants immortality. Seath's experiments could be seen as an alchemical endeavor gone awry. Seath embodies the archetype of the mad scholar or sorcerer who delves too deeply into forbidden knowledge, much like Faust, who sells his soul for ultimate understanding only to be destroyed by it. Knowledge in myth is often both a gift and a curse, as can be demonstrated by Seath's story. Obtaining all of the Lord Souls brings the chosen undead to the first flame, where they must defeat the hollow shell of Gwyn and bring about one of two endings. Seeing Gwyn really reinforces the failure of his sacrifice, cementing him as a dying king and not a resurrecting or living one. The dying king is a figure whose decline signals the waning of an era. His fall reflects myths where a king's death or failure necessitates renewal and the rise of a new hero. Gwyn's act of kindling the flame also reflects the myth of Prometheus that we mentioned. Prometheus, after giving fire to humanity, suffers eternal punishment for defying the gods. Gwyn's sacrifice, too, binds him to an eternity of torment. Defeating him, we can decide to become essentially the same as him, despite all we learned, sacrificing ourselves to relink the flame. This act of self-sacrifice might even make us a meaningless lord over a coming age. This is a cyclical perpetuation of the cause. Choosing to become the Dark Lord may not be the bad ending in this context. Who's to say that the Age of Dark is not actually necessary, as Koth said? And as I've mentioned, it seems that either ending is still actually going to result in the cycle continuing and sending us to the events of Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 1 raises a question of duality, whether light is good and dark is bad, or whether light and dark are two sides of a necessary coin. So this is not the end of the story. What seems like a decision of infinite importance to the chosen undead is revealed to be a hollow journey, propagating the cycle for ages to come until the events of Dark Souls 3. It is revealed that a seemingly new land called Lothric is now the setting, and pilgrims have discovered that the fire is fading and more are needed to link it once again. Those who have linked the flame are called Lords of Cinder, and this new era of the cycle is represented by cinders and ashes, showing that the vibrance of Gwyn's sun and flame have all but vanished and been snuffed out from the time of Dark Souls 1. This trope of brightness lost can be seen throughout, such as in how Anor Londo is revealed to have fallen into a snowy, cold, grey city rather than the golden sun city of the heavens that it once was. The pilgrimage and church imagery recurs and is even more prevalent in other ways this time around. The Firekeepers still usher Ashen humanity to complete the ritual once again, needing to do the job of the Lords of Cinder who refuse to repeat the fire-linking task. The previously mentioned Church of the Deep is perhaps the most interesting new aspect of the story of Dark Souls 3, with the most ties to church and religious symbology. The Cathedral of the Deep serves as a physical and thematic representation of corrupted faith and the perversion of religious institutions. The entirety of this corruption seems to be in the service of the deadly sin of gluttony. Aldrich starts as a supposedly upright cleric in the church, but develops an interesting habit for consuming men, as Hawkwood tells us, eating so many that he bloats like a drowned pig, and is then christened a lord. Some serious questions remain. Why did Aldrich start eating people? Why does this make him powerful? The symbolism here is some of From Software's most interesting work. It does make me think of a perversion of the Eucharist idea in Christianity. The early Christians were actually accused of cannibalism for saying that they were eating Christ's body and drinking his blood. But in this instance, Aldrich is literally cannibalizing men, and it becomes the sole focus of the religion, especially once he finds and consumes a god. Aldrich also seems to consume the souls of his victims, souls which hold power in the Dark Souls universe, obviously. This will also be seen in Slave Knight Gael's later consumption of the Pygmies' Dark Souls. Aldrich has a vision of the Age of Deep Sea, which he believed would replace the ages of Fire and Dark. This Deep Sea idea is incredibly reflective of the idea of the primordial waters of chaos that we talked about earlier, present in a number of creation myths like the biblical, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian. This seems to be a signal that the age Aldrich is trying to achieve could be a complete reset to a time that would result in complete and absolute nothingness, a primordial chaos from which only some divine figure could create anew. This is symbolized in what Aldrich becomes. After consuming enough that he bloats, when we eventually find him in the Grand Cathedral of Old Anor Londo, he is reminiscent of a deep dark sea himself, covering the entire floor and appearing as nothing but dark sludge. Interestingly, the deep spells tell us that an aspect of the deep exists within every person, which is kind of an idea that this potential for chaos is potential for everyone. It's possible that this potential is what Aldrich reached in his chaotic and anti-human pursuit of cannibalism. The human dregs item description says that dregs are the heaviest within the human body and will sink to the lowest depths imaginable, where they become the shackles that bind this world. Perhaps this idea has some relevance to the waters of the Ash Lake from Dark Souls 1 and the arch trees that hold up the world. The idea is almost of everything in existence sinking back into the primordial soup from which it came. Another faith aspect of the Deep Church is their spread of their religion. Aldrich's deacons get to such a point where they are archbishops trained in magic of the deep, and to where they have so-called evangelists who go out and spread the message to get new believers, whom they actually bring back to their cathedral to be fed to Aldrich. Much like in Bloodborne, the actions of everyone in this church are so dreadful that it defies reason to even call them saints. The Church of the Deep is almost a full parody of the Christian Church, down to the fact that they worship the deep, which represents the original enemy of God, if you will. God creates out of the deep waters at the beginning of time, and in the Babylonian version I mentioned, Marduk defeats the deep waters personified by the sea serpent Tiamat. So the deep sea represents the primordial concept of chaos and the ancient serpent that is anti-creation and anti-life in essence. The realms of the Abyss, Death, and Hell remain ever present in Dark Souls 3. From Farron Keep, down through the catacombs of Karthus and into the Smoldering Lake. It seems like an interesting representation of the different realms than portrayed in Dark Souls 1. Whereas the Catacombs, New Londo, and Izalith are quite separate in Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3 has a beautiful progression to it, in adventuring down from the capital city to the suburbs, to the rural, to the forest, to the swamp, and then finally down to the grave. Death comes first, and then at the lowest point we find the hellish ruined landscape of Izalith that is the Smoldering Lake. This represents almost a more traditional descent into the underworld that is present in so many stories, even something like Dante's Inferno, where the story just continues to get worse and worse and it goes down and down. Down in the pits of hell, we find it interestingly victim to the same cyclical curse of the passing of time that the rest of the world is, with the remains of dead demons from Dark Souls 1 just all over the place, and just one single old demon left as king. It is very interesting that it takes the form of a fiery lake, where the demonic forces are wiped out, which heavily reminds me of the Christian eschatological view where at the end of time, Christ casts the devil and his angels into the lake of fire, either to be tormented or annihilated. Lower than the catacombs, but seemingly higher than hell, is Irithyll, the Boreal Valley. The religious symbology resumes here in a variety of ways. As the player will learn, this city is actually the fallen remnants of Anor Londo, the golden city in the heavens reduced to a snow-covered museum in a deep valley. This seems something like a contrast between heaven and earth, almost like C.S. Lewis's analogy from the Chronicles of Narnia, where Satan's control over earth is represented by the White Witch's ice and snow oppression of the world. It also makes me think of cold and callous religion, as the city hosts the remnant of a theocracy complete with Pontiff Sullivan, pontiff being that religious or governance title sometimes associated with the Pope. The city might suggest a poorly or just coldly run and false religion, being the original sun worship set in motion in the Gwyn era by his children, and having been so false that it progressed into a frozen, meaningless religious practicum. This sterility is also represented in Dante's Inferno, where the ninth circle of hell has its traitors frozen in ice. At the end of the day, it really just represents another polar opposite, no pun intended, as presented in the first game. Darkness is the opposite of light, but the opposite of sun and warmth and light may also be found in moon and snow and cold. The Golden Sun Kingdom has become the moon. It is also representative of the Dark Sun Gwyndolin, and the crossover between the two can be seen in the dual fire and dark magic swords used by the Pontiff and his knights. My point about the snow, though, will come up later, as I do think the snow is more associated with the divine and purifying imagery, and that's going to be really important for my end conclusion. The Draconic and Serpentine symbolism returns in full force in Dark Souls 3 as well. The first is again a focus of the symbolism of forbidden knowledge as associated with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Just like Seath in the first game, there is another scaleless draconic figure that pursues some sort of knowledge and is consumed, being King Osiris. He also demonstrates a Luciferian fall from power, going from being a king to wandering blindly around the gardens, just outside the catacombs, with an invisible child that may or may not exist. Osiris seems interestingly obsessed with the lineage of his son Ocelot, and his being a child of dragons. Though not specific, it's interesting to note his obsession with creating a progeny that is perhaps more powerful than him, and yet coming up empty, as it isn't clear whether Ocelot even exists at all. Ocelot, to me, seems to relate to this pursuit of secret wisdom that results in being consumed. It is also like putting all one's hope into something that doesn't exist, looking for something that cannot be found. Osiris asks Ocelot what he would have to fear, being a child of dragons, betraying what was perhaps his own fear that he came from. This fear leads him to being consumed, and even projecting his hope into a powerful child that may or may not really exist. Having also mentioned the imagery of dragons in Dark Souls 1, we mentioned the firstborn son of Gwyn's choice to ally himself with the dragons. In Dark Souls 3, we get to see the outcome of the Nameless King's decision. The Archdragon Peak is the place of the old dragons, from the ancient wyvern to the serpentine mobs that roam the mountaintop. The dragons are worshipped on the peak, like a mountaintop sanctuary for this hidden faith. Much in the vein of the secret knowledge correlation, it takes a secret draconic gesture recovered from the catacombs behind Osiris to even be able to access the peak, and the act must be performed in a kind of monk-like meditation on the edge of a cliff looking over at the mountaintop crags in the far distance. Whether for good or bad, the Nameless King betrayed his father to associate himself with these dragons, partnered with his new dragon companion when we encounter him at the Bell's Toll. The betrayal of his father and decimation from the history books makes him satanic perhaps in archetype, though that's difficult to posit considering the aforementioned negative aspects of Gwyn's symbolism. But being expunged from the records is a harsh punishment. It shows him being completely disowned. It's interesting to me that he becomes the Nameless King. He maintains rank, but not identity. He is still a king, just not a part of any lineage or family or record. Again, I'm drawn to the Luciferian symbology. Many take Lucifer to be the original name of Satan before his fall, but it is just a Latin word that means shining one. Really, we do not know from the biblical corpus any name for Satan as an angelic being. Instead, he receives titles after being thrown out of his family. He is called Satan, thus Satan, meaning adversary or accuser. He is called the prince of the power of the air. He is called the ruler of the world. Like the nameless king, he maintains a title and power, but is thrown to the side and remanded to separateness from the royal family for his betrayal, and has his name revoked. These are themes within themes and layers within layers. I find Gwyn to be a closer archetype to Satan in other ways, with his Zeus-like imagery and as the head of a pantheon. But given that Gwyn does not have a power to betray, really, it's more so that he is a fallen and negative archetype of God and his children, manifest as the pantheons of Greek gods or as the hosts of the fallen angels. The final dragon we encounter is in the DLC, as I'm sure you've never forgotten. Dark Eater Midir was raised by Gwyn and the gods to serve as a fighter against the dark that Gwyn feared as the ending to the Age of Fire and Light. This is interesting as it shows Gwyn here being willing to work with a dragon in some capacity, though it does seem that Midir was almost adopted and raised completely by the gods, which would separate him heavily from the dragons of their own will that the Nameless King allies with. He is titled as the Dark Eater for fending off the dark and in some way consuming or undertaking it, and just like Artorias, he is corrupted by it to some degree. Midir ends up fighting the dark for long after the gods are gone into the future age of the Ringed City. He's practically enslaved, so it's hard for me to see him as an archetype of the evil serpentine nature in any way. He only showcases the idea of the old and evil powers being forgotten except to when they are summoned and enslaved to be used only for their power. The taming of beasts like Leviathan or Jormungandr or Pegasus even. But this, for the most part, is the last we see of the ancient dragons, seemingly in the last true descendant of the archdragons themselves, thrown to the ground and then finally slain by us. Back in the end areas of the main game, we finalize Irithyll by defeating the evil Aldrich, consumer of gods, whom has misappropriated the prior heavenly Anorlando for himself. We've already discussed Aldrich, so the final point to touch on is Irithyll Dungeon, which leads us down to the profaned capital. This area has a couple of interesting ideas. The first is its namesake, the Profane Flame. This flame is sort of mysterious in Dark Souls lore, and continues to be speculated about to this day. Its origins are unclear, its cause is unclear, and its meaning is just as unclear. It seems to originate down here. There's some suggestion that it has to do with a certain sect of witches. There is a possible suggestion by Andre that it is an incorporation of the Chaos Flame from Dark Souls 1 with the Abyss. In many ways, it definitely reflects the idea of the Chaos Flame again. A blasphemous or heretical or profane manifestation of the true flame. I think it once again represents chaos. For one reason or another, the flame consumes the kingdom of Yorm the Giant, either as punishment or as consequence for his flame-linking actions, or as a chaotically random occurrence. It seems to be as simple a suggestion as the idea that playing with fire causes one to get burnt. I see it as almost a side effect of the meaningless fire-linking process that has been carried on for this long. Yorm the Giant seems to see it in the same way. Yorm is called the Reclusive Giant for the fact that after he links the flame and his peoples are burned and destroyed, he relinquished his shield and two-hands his machete, no longer valuing his own life, and basically locks himself up in the capital throne room to await judgment. It even seems that he is prepared for this outcome, asking his longtime friend Sigurd to put him out of his misery if such a time comes that he is resurrected to link the flame again. Yorm seems to be the last of the giants. Lore items stating that he descends from a great conqueror, which some interpret to be High Lord Wolnir and others see as the Giant Lord from Dark Souls 2. Either way, Yorm is the only giant we encounter. I find this encounter sort of similar to the David and Goliath story, for obvious reasons, but not only in the essence of a human or pygmy taking on the role of killing a giant, but also in the extermination of a kind. In the biblical sense, Goliath is one of the last of the Nephilim, the giants that are created by human women mating with fallen angels. David kills not only Goliath, but later eliminates the rest of Goliath's family, and thereby exterminates the last of the giants. In Dark Souls 3, this elimination is really a tragedy, as Yorm seems pure in his intentions, having made friends with the pure-hearted Sigurd of Katarina, and desired the best for his people in trying to protect them from the Profane Flame. Upon defeat of either Yorm or Aldrich, the Ashen One has finally slain the last of the previous Flame Linkers, and is called back to Lothric to ascend. Most of the significance of the surrounding areas does not necessarily apply to the discussion at hand. For instance, I can't glimpse any strong points from going back in time after defeating Osiris and encountering the darkened Firelink Shrine and defeating Champion Gundyr, except to further illustrate just how long this firelinking process has been going on and how futile it continues to be. Still, the Ashen One travels on to the throne of the prince. Yet another character has confined themselves to their bedroom and throne room, all in one, and refused to participate in the firelinking cycle. Prince Lothric, with a curse of some kind, seems to be in a state of youth and femininity. I compared him to Miquella in my Elden Ring video, as well as to Gwyndolin. All these are types of this character, emasculate and refined in the magical or faith arts. Miquella and Lothric in particular take on this type though, especially because of their sort of purity seeming and rebelliousness. Lothric, however, is accompanied by his brother Lorien, who had sacrificed part of himself to help save Lothric's life in some way. Prior, Lorien was a champion knight who defeated the demon prince, which left his sword scorched. But now, Lorien is left unable to stand and mute. He has dedicated himself only to the defense of his brother. Upon seemingly slaying Lorien, he is revitalized by Lothric, at which point they fight together. Many theorize that Lorien and Lothric's life is tied to one another, seemingly by Lorien's prior sacrificial action. Lothric must be killed to kill them both. I see these two as a highly unique brother story, not fitting into any typical brother's archetype, and there are many. It goes back to how I see Dark Souls 3 illustrated as a particularly unique tragedy story, an analysis of meaningless existence. It is almost unbearably nihilistic. Though sacrifice and character story is present, it is almost all in service of no outcome. Even the preservation of Lothric's life has no clear purpose, as they dwell alone in Lothric's bedroom for all time. I will choose to take this lesson, then, to point toward meaning. The firelinking process which accomplishes naught is meaningless, but an existence with a clear outcome is not. In other words, Dark Souls 3 is a world that desperately needs God, desperately needs love, and desperately needs meaning. It is now time to finish the DLC. I will address some of the interesting notes about Frida and Ariandel before focusing on the story of Slave Knight Gael, which I think really draws the concepts present to a close. In Dark Souls, it seems that worlds are created by painting, or at least new ones are. The base, meaningless world that we have been in since Dark Souls 1 is decided first by the painted world of Ariamis, which is used to hide certain types of creatures and people taking refuge from the harsh world. In the painted world of Ariandel, this concept is furthered. The hideous Corvians that have been seen throughout the game have taken refuge here, among a number of other creatures. Ariandel, who's presumably the painter of the world, as well as one of the daughters representing the Pygmies, or mankind, Frida, are defending and guarding or ruling the world. The problem with these painted worlds, we find out, is that they are temporary. In other words, there is no permanent escape from the meaningless existence of Dark Souls into a tranquil world. These paintings eventually begin to rot. These worlds must be generated by sacrifice as well. They are painted with blood. Ariandel can be found flailing himself to generate more blood in order to keep the world perpetuating and fight off the invading rot. This is a temporary solution, and it seems that Frida and others are searching for a permanent one. This brings us to the new painter. She seems to be part human and dragon, possibly a descendant of the prior mentioned Priscilla from Dark Souls 1, who I said represents maybe the connection between the human and divine, like Christ. She's also seemingly pure and innocent, and it either way seems that she originates from the painted worlds. It is not of the corrupt regular world, which is really important. The painter is searching for a sustainable type of blood in order to create a permanent home of peace and happiness for the afflicted peoples and creatures that does not have to be sustained by continuous sacrifice. This brings us finally to Slave Knight Gael. Gael's backstory is somewhat important for the points I'm going to make, and I will link a specific Reddit analysis of his character that is incredibly well done and imperative to my own interpretation. The slave knights represent literal slaves that were in service to the powers that be and were sent into wars and battles to fight and die, essentially less than worthless, the lowest of the low. This particular slave knight was at some point brought into the painted world and encountered the painter, maybe through Frida or Priscilla, and found purpose in serving them. He has been placed on the hunt for this perpetual and sustaining blood to allow the painter to create an eternal paradisal world. All the way back in Dark Souls 1, we are introduced to the concept of the Dark Soul, the game's namesake obviously, but the thing which is obtained by the furtive pygmy which results in humanity. Humanity is considered part of the Dark Soul, and this is what sustains the pygmy or the humans. As the humans lose humanity, they lose Dark Soul and become hollow, falling into purposelessness and meaninglessness, losing life and the meaning of life, if you will. Life is meaningless, making the death and resurrection cycle of the games meaningless. But Gael recognizes the Dark Soul as the source of humanity and life for the furtive pygmy. As such, he goes in pursuit of it as a potential solution. This brings him, and later us, to the Ringed City, which is the place that Gwyn set aside for the Pygmy Lords and the Dark Soul to be guarded and hidden away, probably in an effort to contain its power. Importantly, Gael also seems to recognize the harmful power of the Dark Soul. The Pygmy Lords are the ones who hold it and seem to have been corrupted in some way by its power. When Gael finally finds them, locked away behind the shield of the dreams of Gwyn's daughter, Filianor, they are dried up and meaningless, like the landscape of the true Ringed City that Filianor hides, a heap of ashes. Gael consumes the darkened blood of all the Pygmy Lords, absorbing their fractions of the Dark Soul, and eventually consuming the entirety of the Dark Soul within himself. He seems now monstrous and adversarial, corrupt and only a remnant of his former self. But the Redditor I mentioned earlier and myself see this as intentional. When Gael encounters us, the Ashen One, initially, he sees our warrior power and our potential to slay the gods, as we so do. Consider the seeming possibility that Gael, in service to the painter, recognizes that the power of the Dark Soul is corrupting, but also powerful enough to create a blood that is sustainable to use as ink for the painting. Gael knows that if he consumes it all, he will create this powerful blood of the Dark Soul, but that he will be lost in the process. So he ensures that there is someone more powerful than him set on the right course. He intends for the Ashen One to follow him and finally to slay him, and thereby recover the blood of the Dark from him, and take it back to the painter to result in the creation of a new world. The original poster and myself see Gael as an important sacrificial figure who finally ends the horrible cycle of Dark Souls. I find that both Dark Souls 1 and 3 slowly set up this meaningless, nihilistic, and hopeless world, all until we get to Eryandel and encounter the Painter, perhaps the only positive and innocent character in all of the games, joyful and full of potential. We in Gael acquire hope that something could be different, so we set off in pursuit of the creation of a new world. Gael is importantly the lowest of the low, a slave, and a representative of the lowest of humanity. I'm reminded of Christ, who takes on the lowly form of a human to accomplish his sacrificial purpose. He spends his time with those of the lowest status, the slaves and the servants, the lowly, and through the lowly, he saves the world. Jesus sacrifices himself, descends into hell and darkness, allowing himself to be killed, shedding his blood, which cleanses and purifies the world and allows them to obtain eternal life and peace. These themes, I feel, carry over to Gael. This lowly knight sacrifices himself, descending from a lowly but noble position to a disgusting self, a corrupted shell, but with the intention of allowing himself to be killed and shedding his blood, which now imbued with the power of the Dark Soul is able to be used on the painting to create an eternal and pure world, at least, hopefully, what the painter calls a cold, dark, and very gentle place. It seems to me that Gael sacrifices himself for the eternal life of the lowly. The snow and cold I also find interesting. While gentle sounds like a desirable characteristic, cold and dark seem an interesting desirability. But in the sense of Dark Souls, it seems to be in contrast to the falsehood of the established order. Gwyn is the corrupt, oppressive figure toward humanity, and he represents the light. He has been afraid of the Age of the Dark, which in both games humanity is pursuing. Thereby, the dark is desirable. It represents humanity, the Dark Soul, as we've mentioned. In regular symbology, the light represents goodness, but in Dark Souls, it is corruption, and it is turned on its head. Not only light, but also Gwyn's rule is the Age of Fire, or warmth, if you will. The painted world immediately and harshly contrasts this, with their snow-covered and cold terrain. In Dark Souls 1, Ariamis is the only landscape which is snow-covered in this way. Fire, light, sun, and warmth do not allow for the presence of snow. That requires the cold and dark. This is shown well in the games. Although both Ariamis and Eryandel have enemies, they are strikingly peaceful. Seeing the Corvians peacefully gather outside of Freed's Ariandel chapel somewhat illustrates this, as does Priscilla not attacking the chosen undead, but allowing them simply to leave. The snow-covered terrain offers itself to a drastically more cozy vibe, if you will. Interestingly, in correlation with the blood imagery related to the painting of the New Worlds, I think that the biblical idea fits well. Isaiah says that though sin paints the world scarlet red, the blood of Christ washes them white as snow. Whiteness, snow, and wool are used in the Bible to demonstrate purity and holiness. For instance, white as wool being the color of God and Christ's hair in the heavenly realm. Dark Souls chooses to use snow and white as its symbols of desirability and purity. The heaven of Dark Souls is white and snowy, and this is the heaven or paradise that the painter is trying to create. A cold, dark, and very gentle place. Gentleness being essentially the extreme opposite of the world in Dark Souls. The From Software games are infamous for being games where almost every single entity that you approach will attack you. There are very few friendly people or NPCs, making them all the more striking when you come across them. Gentleness is so contrary to this, a place of peace, not fighting or warring. To summarize, I think the painter and Slave Knight Gael represent the true and good ending of the entirety of Dark Souls. The whole of the story showcases the horrible nihilism and the meaninglessness of wars and fighting among the gods, leading only to the subjugation and oppression of humanity. The two endings to Dark Souls 1, we know, both result in the cycle continuing, even if the dark ending allows humanity to prosper for a short time. The cycle proceeds hundreds or thousands of years into the future into the time of Dark Souls 3, where the regular game's ending is also the same, dealing with the First Flame in some way again, relinking, extinguishing, or bringing on the Age of Complete Darkness with no clear outcome. But the DLC gives us a truly potential happy ending. All along the course of these eras, there have been individuals who managed to paint worlds of refuge using lifeblood. Eventually, they refine to the point where they seek to create an eternal refuge, a new world. To do this, they need the powerful blood of the Dark Soul, which has been available all along. So a lowly slave ventures in search of this outcome, knowing he will be lost to history and will never see the outcome of his actions, but in hopes that he can sacrifice himself to grant us his empowered blood, which we return to the great painter who creates a new heaven and new earth, if you will. A pure and gentle place, where the violent and meaningless cycle will not carry on. The painter asks for a pigment colored like the dark soul of man, essentially creating a dark place, but a place that is truly intended for man, and not for the corrupt gods. A place painted for the noble slave knight, but a place that, like Moses and the Promised Land, he will never see. I'll leave you with the words of the painter herself.
I wonder when Uncle Gael intends his return. I hope the new painting will be to him a gentle home. My thanks, Ashen One. I will assuredly finish the painting of a cold, dark, and very gentle place. One day, it will make someone a goodly home.
If you've been around this long, thank you so much for watching. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I dare say that my conclusion in this is even better than my conclusion in the Elden Ring analysis, and I think the Dark Souls even lends itself better to the lore and religious symbology in so many ways, and it was just so much fun to revisit and work through Dark Souls with this kind of framework in mind. So I really hope you enjoyed. If you do, please consider sticking around with the channel. I'm really interested in making more content like this. I have other ideas for analyses in the future, but that is only possible through your support. So if you'd consider subscribing and recommending this video and liking and commenting to let me know what I can do better in the future, I would really appreciate that. And again, I just really appreciate you for being here. So I'm just really passionate about these games and how we can glimpse these really important religious and narrative ideas out of them, and I think that's a really awesome thing. It's not just games, but movies and other types of TV and entertainment too that I want to focus on, books and all those kind of things that I'm hoping to do in the future. So again, if you have been, thank you for watching. Consider sticking around. It's been my pleasure to have you. This has been Credence Questions.